Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, but this time, there is no alarm clock, no phone lying beside your pillow, no coffee, no internet, and no modern device to help you begin the day. Before you lies only a thin veil of mist covering a vast field, the smell of smoke rising from a fire still smoldering, and unfamiliar footprints that appeared in the damp earth during the long night. How long do you think you would survive? Perhaps only a few days, maybe even just a few hours. But around 40,000 years ago, this was the everyday reality of our ancestors. They had no supermarkets where they could buy food, no hospitals to treat illnesses, no maps, no GPS, and no survival manuals. Every sunrise could mark the beginning of a hunt stretching across dozens of kilometers, or an encounter with enormous, starving predators. What is astonishing is that they did not merely survive, they thrived. For centuries, the image of the caveman was portrayed as that of a crude, thoughtless human being who knew little beyond carrying a club and hunting animals. But modern archaeology is gradually dismantling that familiar picture. New discoveries reveal that prehistoric humans made musical instruments, created art, constructed complex shelters, cared for the elderly and the injured, passed knowledge down through generations, and developed survival skills that most of us today might struggle to master in an entire lifetime. Even more fascinating is the fact that many of the secrets that helped them endure the Ice Age, natural disasters, and life-threatening crises still hold value for modern humanity. There are things we believe we have improved upon, yet in reality, we may be slowly losing them. So what did an ordinary day truly look like for a person living tens of thousands of years ago? How did they wake up? What did they do? How did they raise their children? And what allowed them to survive for hundreds of thousands of years in a world where almost everything had the power to take their lives? Today's journey will take us back through time to uncover the answers. And perhaps it will also make you look at your own modern life from an entirely different perspective. If you had the chance to stand before a person from the Stone Age and watch him begin a new day, the first thing that surprised you probably would not be his stone weapons or clothing made from animal skins. What would astonish you even more would be the way he observed the world. As soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared on the horizon, he would not immediately rush to find food, nor would he charge off to hunt, as movies often portray. Instead, he would spend the first few minutes reading the environment around him. A gentle wind changing direction, the smell of earth after the night's rain, birdsong that was unusually sparse, footprints still visible in the mud. To us, these may seem like insignificant details, but to prehistoric humans, every one of these signs was like a stream of information appearing on a computer screen. They revealed how the weather might change, which direction the herds had traveled, and whether a predator had recently passed through the area. This was not instinct. It was knowledge accumulated over countless generations. Today, we only need to open our phones to know exactly when it will rain. Our ancestors had no such privilege. If they misread the signs of nature, they could become lost for days, miss a migrating herd, or worse, walk directly into the territory of a cave bear weighing nearly half a ton. That is why their powers of observation developed to an extraordinary level. Researchers often say that modern humans are highly skilled at processing digital information, but prehistoric humans possessed a different kind of intelligence, ecological intelligence. They understood the seasons in which different plants produced fruit. They knew which plants could heal and which contained poison. They knew when fish began to migrate and when reindeer herds would appear on the grasslands. None of this knowledge existed in books. It existed in memory. It was a living library passed from one generation to the next through observation, practice, and storytelling. A prehistoric adult had to memorize an astonishing amount of information. They needed to recognize hundreds of different plant species, distinguish countless animal tracks, understand the characteristics of different stones used to make tools, and remember the locations of water sources, shelters, and migration routes extending for hundreds of kilometers. If we forget an email password, we simply click Forgot Password. But if a prehistoric person forgot the location of a water source during the dry season, the entire group might pay for that mistake with their lives. The pressure of survival forced the human brain to develop in remarkable ways. Every decision was the result of thousands of invisible calculations taking place inside the mind. They constantly weighed reward against risk. Should they continue following the herd or turn back before darkness fell? Should they cross a river whose waters were rising or search for another route? Should they burn more wood to stay warm or conserve fuel for the days ahead? This was not the life of primitive, thoughtless people. It was the life of true strategists. This also explains why many recent archaeological discoveries are completely transforming the way we view our ancestors. They did not merely create tools for hunting. They also made objects that required an exceptionally advanced level of thought. And one of the most astonishing discoveries was not a weapon, but a tiny musical instrument buried beneath the earth for tens of thousands of years. No one knows exactly what the musician's name was. We do not know how he lived, what language he spoke, or how many brutal winters he endured. But approximately 40,000 years ago, inside a cave located in what is now Germany, a human being spent many hours carefully shaping a piece of mammoth ivory. He was not making a spear. He was not making a knife. Nor was he creating any tool intended for hunting. Instead, he carefully carved a series of small holes into the ivory, aligning the distance between them with extraordinary precision. After an immense amount of work, an object emerged. It was a flute. When archaeologists uncovered the artifact, they could hardly believe their eyes. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than several broken pieces of ivory scattered among ancient sediment. But after reconstructing it, they realized that it was not an ornament. It was a complete musical instrument. What astonished scientists was not merely its age, it was its precision. The finger holes were positioned at carefully calculated intervals to produce different pitches. When experts reconstructed the flute and attempted to play it, the instrument produced clear musical tones. What does this mean? It proves that prehistoric humans did not merely know how to create sound. They understood how to control it. To accomplish this, the maker had to choose the correct material, calculate the thickness of the flute, determine the position of each finger hole, and predict how air would vibrate inside the instrument. A deviation of only a few millimeters could distort the sound or prevent it from producing a melody at all. This was not the product of luck. It was the result of intelligence, experience, and patience. The discovery shattered a belief that had endured for centuries, the assumption that prehistoric humans cared only about eating and sleeping. If they had time to create music, then their lives could not have been completely dominated by the fear of survival. They had time to create, to appreciate beauty, to share emotion. Music may have echoed around the fire after a successful hunt. It may have been played during rituals, storytelling gatherings, or simply to help the community relax after a long day. And if music existed, rhythm probably existed as well. Where there is rhythm, there is dance. Where there is dance, there is celebration. From one small flute, an entire picture of our ancestors' inner lives begins to emerge. They were not emotionless survival machines. They were human beings capable of being moved by art, just as we are today. And music was not the only evidence. Across Europe and many other regions, archaeologists have discovered sculptures, necklaces made from animal teeth, seashells transported hundreds of kilometers from distant coastlines, and countless colorful cave paintings that have survived for tens of thousands of years. None of these objects helped them hunt more efficiently. They did not keep their bodies warm. They did not increase the amount of available food. And yet, prehistoric people still spent hours, sometimes even weeks, creating them. Why? Perhaps because from the earliest stages of our existence, humans did not merely want to survive. They wanted their lives to have meaning. And that desire may have guided the human brain along a path entirely different from that of every other creature on Earth. But art represented only a small part of their lives. What surprised scientists even more was the way these people organized their daily work. Contrary to what many people imagine, they did not labor from sunrise to sunset merely to obtain food. The reality was very different. If you ask a modern person what makes life most exhausting, many will answer that it is work. Working 8 hours a day, working overtime, getting stuck in traffic, living under financial pressure. We often assume that prehistoric humans must have worked many times harder, that they spent every waking moment hunting, gathering, and fighting against nature. That assumption sounds reasonable, but studies of hunter-gatherer communities that have survived into the modern era reveal a very different picture. Anthropologists have found that the amount of time spent on activities directly related to obtaining food often lasted only about 4 to 6 hours each day. The remaining time was used for resting, talking, repairing tools, caring for children, telling stories, learning new skills, and participating in community activities. This does not mean that their lives were easy. On the contrary, their work required an extraordinarily high level of expertise. Making a single spear point could take many hours, or even several days. First, the correct type of stone had to be found. Not every stone could be shaped into a sharp blade. A craftsperson had to distinguish between flint, obsidian, and other materials capable of fracturing into thin pieces with razor-sharp edges. Then came hundreds of precise strikes. Every blow required careful calculation of the angle, the force, and the direction in which the stone would fracture. A strike that was only slightly too strong could destroy all the work that had come before it. Modern studies show that even today's experts, after months of training, often struggle to create tools of the same quality as those made by prehistoric people. This proves that the skill was far from simple. It was a craft that required years of learning. Their clothing was also an engineering masterpiece. An animal hide removed from a carcass would quickly decay if it was not treated correctly. They had to scrape away the fat, dry the skin, cure it with smoke, soak it with tannin-rich plants, and soften it by hand for many hours. The result was clothing durable enough to withstand freezing winters. Behind every garment made from animal skin were dozens of complicated steps that most of us today know nothing about. The same was true of building shelters. Contrary to the image of cavemen spending their entire lives inside caves, most hunter-gatherer communities moved regularly with the seasons. They built dome-shaped shelters from bent wooden frames, covering them with multiple layers of animal skins or dried grass. In some cold regions, mammoth bones were used as structural supports because wood was extremely scarce. Interestingly, the interiors of these shelters already contained clearly divided spaces. There were areas for sleeping, places for preparing food, spaces for storing tools, and a central location for the fire. Some archaeological sites even reveal simple drainage systems designed to keep the floor dry after heavy rain. That was planning, not instinct. More importantly, they did not do everything alone. A successful hunter-gatherer community functioned like a team of specialists. Some people excelled at tracking animals. Some understood plants and medicine. Some were known for crafting tools. Others were especially skilled at tanning hides or sewing. No one knew everything. But when the knowledge of every individual was combined, the community formed an incredibly powerful collective brain. This is also why humans did not become the most powerful species through physical strength. We became dominant through our ability to cooperate, and that cooperation created a network of connections so vast that even modern archaeologists have been astonished by it. Archaeological discoveries made in recent decades have forced scientists to ask a fascinating question. How could small communities scattered across Europe, Asia, and Africa share similar tool-making techniques, jewelry designs, and even artistic styles, despite being separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers? The answer lies in something few people expected. Prehistoric humans were not isolated. They were far more connected than we once believed. At many archaeological sites, researchers have discovered seashells deep inland, hundreds of kilometers from the coast. At other locations, they found obsidian, an extremely sharp volcanic glass, whose original source was several days' journey away. This could only have happened in one of two ways. Either people traveled across enormous distances themselves, or exchange networks existed between many different communities. Whichever explanation is correct, the result was the same. Information traveled, goods were exchanged, people met one another. These were the earliest predecessors of social networks in human history. Today, we can send a message in seconds. Back then, a new idea might take years to spread from one group to another. But what mattered was that it still spread. If one tribe invented a stronger way to attach a spearhead, neighboring groups could learn the technique and improve it. Several generations later, another community might add a new feature. In this way, knowledge continued to accumulate. This is one of the greatest differences between humans and most other animals. A modern beaver builds a dam, much as its ancestors did thousands of years ago. A bird builds its nest according to patterns determined largely by instinct. Humans are different. Every generation can learn from the generation before it, then add to, modify, and pass that knowledge on to the next. Scientists call this cumulative culture. It allowed human technology to develop far more rapidly than biological evolution. There was no need to wait tens of thousands of years for stronger hands or larger brains. All that was needed was one good idea. If the idea was useful, the community remembered it. If it was truly effective, it spread across vast regions. This became the foundation of every civilization that followed. But these networks were not used only to exchange tools. They also allowed humans to exchange survival knowledge. A group that had endured a severe winter could share methods of preserving food. A coastal community could pass on fishing techniques. People living in the mountains knew how to find water during the dry season. Groups living on the plains understood the migration patterns of large herds. Knowledge no longer belonged to a single person. It became the property of the entire community. And the more communities became connected, the more rapidly that knowledge grew. But something even more remarkable was happening. These communities did not merely exchange goods and experience. They cared for one another. In many excavated skeletons, archaeologists have discovered evidence of people who suffered broken arms, broken legs, and even extremely serious injuries. What is remarkable is that their bones had fully healed. This means that the injured person survived for months, or perhaps even years, after the accident. A person with a broken leg could not hunt. They could not gather food. They could not protect themselves. If they had been abandoned, they almost certainly would have died. But they were not abandoned. Someone brought them food. Someone treated their wounds. Someone protected them until they recovered. These were not the actions of people who believed only that the strong should survive and the weak should perish. They were evidence of compassion, of empathy, of an understanding that the strength of the group was always greater than the strength of any individual. Perhaps this was the most powerful weapon that allowed humanity to survive countless catastrophes throughout history. Not claws, not fangs, not muscles, but the ability to survive together. And that lesson was passed to the next generation from the time children were very young, through a form of education completely different from what we recognize today. A modern 10-year-old may already know how to use a smartphone, watch videos online, or play a video game with considerable skill. But imagine placing that child alone in a wild forest without an adult. How long would they survive? This is not a question meant to criticize modern children. Their environment is simply completely different. A child living 30 or 40,000 years ago, however, was trained from an early age to become a capable adult. What is remarkable is that they did not learn from books. There were no classrooms, no blackboards, no examinations. And yet their education was extraordinarily effective. Every morning was a lesson. Every hunting expedition was a practical class. Every conversation around the fire was an opportunity to pass on experience. Instead of simply telling children which animal had made a particular footprint, adults allowed them to observe for themselves. They asked questions. What do you notice that seems unusual? Why is this footprint deeper than the other one? If you were this animal, which direction would you travel? These questions forced the child's brain to think. Not merely to remember, but to analyze. Today, neuroscientists call this experiential learning, one of the most effective ways for the brain to form lasting connections. Prehistoric humans did not know that term, but they had been applying the principle for tens of thousands of years. Children growing up in nature learned by watching adults work each day. Boys followed hunters to learn how to read animal tracks. Girls observed how medicinal plants were selected, food was processed, and hides were tanned. However, these divisions were not always as rigid as many people assume. In many hunter-gatherer communities, children were encouraged to learn a wide range of skills. What mattered most was not gender. It was the ability to contribute to the group. While adults worked, children did not remain idle. Their games were actually forms of training. Throwing stones at targets developed accuracy. Chasing one another built endurance. Climbing trees taught balance. Watching birds and animals strengthened concentration. Some anthropologists even suggest that play was humanity's first laboratory. It was a place where children were allowed to make mistakes, to experiment, to explore, without facing consequences that were too dangerous. By adolescence, they could participate in many of the community's real responsibilities. A boy of around 12 might know how to start a fire in the rain. He might know how to track several species of animals, how to sharpen stone tools, how to determine direction using the sun and stars. A girl of the same age might recognize dozens of edible plants, know how to prepare food, treat animal hides, weave cordage, and use basic medicinal herbs. None of these skills were learned in a few weeks. They were accumulated gradually throughout childhood. That is why, by the age of 15 or 16, many prehistoric teenagers were already capable of becoming full members of their communities. Not because they were forced to grow up prematurely, but because their entire society was designed to help every child learn through daily life. Knowledge was not passed on only through work. It was also preserved through stories. When darkness fell and the day's work was complete, people gathered around the fire. It was not merely a place to stay warm, it was the library of the tribe. Elders told stories about hunts from long ago, about brutal winters, about the river that once swept away an entire group, about the plant that saved their ancestors during a year of famine. To children, these were fascinating stories, but to the community, they were a way to preserve collective memory. A lesson told through a story is always easier to remember than a dry list of instructions. Perhaps this is why storytelling became one of humanity's most powerful survival tools. It allowed knowledge to cross time and pass through generations long before writing was invented. And through this ability to preserve experience, humans did not merely learn how to adapt to the world. They continually improved their ability to shape it through new inventions, beginning a chain of innovation that extended across millions of years of human evolution. When we look back across the entire history of human evolution, there is one fact that is easy to overlook. Humanity's greatest turning points did not always begin with enormous inventions. Sometimes, everything began with a single stone. Around 2.6 million years ago, on the vast grasslands of Africa, one of our distant ancestors picked up 2 stones. But instead of using them as other animals might, to crack nuts or frighten enemies away, they did something completely different. They deliberately struck the stones together. Not accidentally, not out of momentary curiosity, but because an image had appeared inside their mind. An image of something that did not yet exist. A tool. This was a remarkable moment in evolutionary history. For the first time, the human brain was not merely reacting to the world around it. It was beginning to imagine. That became the foundation of every act of creation that followed. A stone hand axe does not appear naturally. The maker must first imagine its final form, choose the correct stone, determine the point of impact, calculate the striking force, and continually adjust after every blow. The entire process requires planning, spatial reasoning, and extremely precise control of movement. Scientists once conducted a fascinating experiment. They used magnetic resonance imaging to observe the brain activity of modern people learning to make stone tools using ancient techniques. The results surprised many researchers. The activated areas of the brain were nearly identical to those used when a pianist practiced a complex piece of music or when a surgeon performed an operation requiring exceptional precision. What does this mean? It means that Stone Age toolmaking was not nearly as simple as we often imagine. It was a sophisticated skill, a skill requiring years of practice. This also explains why human stone technology continued to improve across millions of years. At first, there were only sharp flakes used to cut meat. Then came hand axes with nearly perfect symmetry. Next came spear points, scrapers, sewing needles, fishhooks, projectile weapons, and dozens of other specialized tools. Each new invention did not completely replace what came before it. It added to it. It refined it. It became the foundation for the next generation. This is the power of cumulative culture. When an individual invented something useful and later died, the knowledge did not disappear. It continued to live in the memory of the community. Then it was improved, then passed on again. In this way, millions of minds worked together to solve a challenge extending across the entire history of human evolution. But perhaps the most important invention was not the stone axe, nor was it the spear. It was fire. Today, lighting a flame takes less than a second. We rarely think about the true value of fire. But for our ancestors, learning to control fire meant changing the destiny of the entire species. Fire provided light after the sun had set. Fire frightened predators away. Fire allowed humans to cook food, making meat softer, easier to digest, and capable of releasing more energy. That surplus energy helped nourish a brain that was becoming increasingly large. But fire did even more. It extended the human working day. After darkness fell, people could still repair tools, tell stories, teach children, create music, and strengthen social relationships around the flickering flames. Some anthropologists even believe that evenings spent beside the fire helped accelerate the development of language. Once people were no longer occupied with hunting or gathering, they had time to talk, to exchange experience, to describe their journeys, to plan for tomorrow. And from there, human communication developed faster than ever before. Yet fire reached its full power only when combined with an even greater invention. An invisible invention that cannot be excavated from the earth, but one that transformed the entire course of human history: language. Imagine standing in a valley 40,000 years ago. There are no signs, no maps, no instruction manuals. How would you explain to another person that a herd of reindeer moved north 3 days ago? How would you describe a water source located 2 days' journey away? How would you warn others about a pride of cave lions hiding behind the bushes? Pointing would not be enough. Simple sounds would not be enough. To communicate complex ideas, humans needed something more powerful: language. Today, we take speech for granted. But in evolutionary history, it was perhaps one of the greatest leaps that ever occurred. Language did not merely allow humans to communicate, it allowed them to share thoughts. Those are two completely different things. A wolf can howl to signal danger. A monkey can cry out when it sees an eagle. That is communication. But a human can say, "Do not cross that river in the spring, because last year the water rose too quickly." Or, "If we circle around the hill at sunset, the bison will not notice us." This is no longer a reaction to the present. It is the ability to communicate things that are not immediately visible. Scientists call this symbolic thought. Through this ability, humans could speak about the past, plan for the future, describe distant places, discuss events that had never occurred, and even imagine entirely new worlds. Almost no other animal can do this to the same degree. Language did not merely transform society. It also transformed the brain itself. When children learn to speak, millions of new neural connections are formed. Every new word is like a key opening another door of perception. The more words humans possess to describe the world, the more precisely they can think about it. Perhaps this is why language and thought have always developed together. It is no coincidence that when linguists study modern hunter-gatherer communities, they often discover extraordinarily rich vocabularies in areas connected to the environment. They may use many different words to describe types of snow, to distinguish various forms of animal tracks, to identify dozens of conditions of the wind, to name plants that city dwellers may never have seen. This reflects an important truth. Language develops to serve life. The more closely you must observe something, the more words you create to describe it. But language offered another power that was almost magical. It allowed hundreds of humans to coordinate their actions as though they shared a single brain. A mammoth hunt could not succeed if everyone acted independently. Someone had to lead. Someone had to create a distraction. Someone had to block the animal's escape route. Someone had to prepare replacement spears. Everything needed to be agreed upon in advance. This required discussion, planning, precise instructions. Language transformed a collection of separate individuals into an organized group. It was an evolutionary advantage possessed by very few species. But the true miracle did not end there. When humans began telling stories beyond their personal experiences, they also began creating shared beliefs. They told stories about ancestors, about spirits, about creatures no one had ever seen, about rules that the entire community agreed to follow. This may have been the beginning of religion. It may have been the beginning of culture. Or perhaps it was the first foundation of every civilization that would follow. From the moment people could believe in the same story, they no longer merely lived beside one another. They began living for one another, cooperating, and building increasingly larger communities. Those communities would carry humanity into a new journey, a journey that would transform the entire planet. And it began with one seemingly simple decision: to stop merely following nature and begin learning how to change it. Then, approximately 12,000 years ago, something once unimaginable began to happen. For millions of years, humans had always moved. They followed the herds. They followed the seasons. They followed water. They followed the changing forests. Movement was the key to survival. But then, in many places around the world, some communities began doing the opposite. They stayed. It was an extraordinarily bold decision. Remaining in one place for too long could quickly exhaust the available natural food. If people continued living entirely through hunting and gathering, the whole community could face starvation. So what changed? The climate. The last ice age gradually came to an end. Temperatures rose. Massive sheets of ice began to melt. Forests expanded. Plants grew more abundantly. Many environments became stable for thousands of consecutive years. For the first time in history, humans had the opportunity to test an entirely new idea. Instead of searching for food, why not grow it? The idea sounds simple to us today, but at the time, it represented a revolution in human thought. Imagine a person accustomed to waking each morning and leaving to search for food. Then, one day, someone says, "Bury this seed in the soil. Wait for several months. Then we will have more food." It was a promise about the future. To believe in it, humans had to delay an immediate reward in exchange for a long-term benefit. This is one of the most complex cognitive abilities of the brain. The first wheat, the first barley, the first fields of millet. They did not appear overnight. They were the result of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of years spent observing nature. Humans noticed that seeds falling onto the ground could sprout. They discovered that the strongest plants often produced more seeds. Gradually, they unintentionally selected the most productive varieties. No one understood genetics at the time, yet they were already performing the work of selective breeders, season after season, generation after generation. And plants were not the only things that changed. Animals began to change as well. The calmest wolves gradually became dogs. Less aggressive goats were kept close to human settlements. Sheep that were easier to manage reproduced more successfully. Humans were no longer merely adapting to nature. They were beginning to shape nature according to their own needs. It was a turning point without precedent. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species became capable of transforming ecosystems on a massive scale. But every revolution has a price. While living as nomads, humans consumed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of different foods throughout the year. Meat, fish, wild fruit, seeds, mushrooms, roots, honey. Their diet was extraordinarily diverse, but when communities turned to agriculture, many became dependent on only a few staple crops. If the harvest failed, if drought continued, if pests appeared, an entire village could fall into crisis. The skeletons of early farmers also tell a revealing story. In many regions, average height decreased. Tooth decay became more common. Signs of malnutrition appeared more frequently. Laboring in fields placed greater pressure on the spine and joints than a hunter-gatherer lifestyle had. In other words, agriculture did not immediately make life easier, but it created something even more important: food surplus. And once a community could produce more food than it needed simply to survive, society began changing at unprecedented speed. Not everyone needed to search for food anymore. Some people specialized in pottery. Some made tools. Some became builders. Some became healers. Some memorized rituals. Some devoted themselves entirely to storytelling. Specialization emerged. Villages grew into towns, then into the first cities. From small fires burning in the grasslands, humanity eventually laid the first foundations of civilization. And strangely, although modern life has transformed almost everything, many traces of that ancient past still remain inside each of us. They hide in the way our brains respond to danger, in the joy we feel when gathering around a meal, in our love of music, in our need to tell stories, and in the strange sense of peace we experience while watching flames flicker in the darkness. The more we understand the lives of prehistoric humans, the more we recognize a deeply paradoxical truth. The distance between them and us is not nearly as great as we imagine. It is true that today we live in brightly illuminated cities. We travel by airplane. We communicate through satellites. We carry phones in our pockets with more computing power than the machines that once carried human beings to the moon. Yet beneath all of these achievements, our brains remain almost identical to the brain of a person who lived 40,000 years ago. That is why an unexpected sound behind us can still make our hearts race. The ancient brain never disappeared. It simply learned to adapt to a new world. That is also why we still enjoy gathering around a dining table, why we still feel comforted when talking with friends in the evening, why we are still captivated by a good story, why music still moves us, why we still desire to explore places we have never visited. These emotions are not products of modern society. They were formed tens of thousands of years ago when our ancestors gathered around fires beneath the night sky. The same is true of anxiety. In the past, anxiety helped people survive. A person who remained alert was more likely to notice a predator. A person who prepared for the worst had a greater chance of surviving winter. Today, the same brain continues to operate in much the same way. The only difference is that the tiger has become a bill. The roar has become a ringing telephone. The storm has become pressure at work. The danger has changed. But the response system remains almost exactly the same. This explains why many human emotions sometimes appear poorly suited to modern life. Our brains were designed for an entirely different world, a world where every decision could determine whether a person lived or died. But that same brain also created every human miracle. It learned to observe the sky and predict the weather. It learned to transform stone into tools, to transform fire into an ally, to transform sound into language, to transform stories into knowledge, to transform small groups of people into vast societies, and ultimately, to transform this planet into humanity's home. When we look at a fossilized skeleton in a museum, it is easy to imagine that we are looking at a creature from a world that no longer exists. But the truth may be far more extraordinary. We are not merely looking into the past. We are looking at ourselves. Every habit, every emotion, every reflex, every dream, all of them carry the traces of millions of years of evolution. Perhaps this is why the question, what was the life of an ordinary prehistoric person really like, has never been only a question about history. It is also a question about the present, because to understand human beings today, sometimes we must return to the place where everything began. And perhaps, after everything archaeology, anthropology, and modern science have revealed, the greatest lesson our ancestors left behind is not found in the spear, the stone, or the fire. It lies in a very simple truth. Human beings have never survived through the strength of individuals alone. We survived because of our ability to learn, because we knew how to share, because we cared for one another, because we never stopped being curious about the world. And that curiosity continues to carry humanity forward, from the dark caves of the Ice Age to the spacecraft exploring the vastness of the universe today. If we could travel back through time and spend a single day living among a prehistoric community, perhaps what would surprise us most would not be the danger. It would be the familiarity. They also woke when the light of dawn appeared. They also worried about their children. They also laughed with their friends. They also shared food. They also told stories after a long day. They also hoped that tomorrow would be better than today. The distance between us and them is not measured in tens of thousands of years. It is measured in technology. Because behind every skyscraper, every smartphone, and every spacecraft, we still carry the brain that was formed when humanity lived among forests, beside fire, beneath a sky filled with stars. Perhaps that is the most remarkable truth archaeology has helped us recognize. Prehistoric humans were not a primitive version of modern people. They were us, living in the first chapter of the human story. If you enjoy stories about history and science told in an accessible and engaging way, do not forget to leave a comment and tell us, if you had to live like a prehistoric human for exactly 1 week, what do you think would be the greatest challenge? We read every comment, and we would truly love to hear your perspective. If this is your first time visiting the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss our newest animated documentaries about history, anthropology, and human evolution. And if you would like to continue exploring the past, watch the next video now. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We will see you in the next video.